Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library, and I'm super excited to be here for the second month with Heather Rogers talking about John Adams in this year-long series about all of the presidents that we can get to every month in a year. So that's 12. I think we're stopping with Zachary somebody. Is that right?
Zachary Taylor.
Secretary Taylor, yeah, but I think that he's the last one because he was the 12th. So stay with us all year long. Stay with us as much as you can. We're going to learn so much as we did last month with when we started off with George Washington. Before we get to Heather, I just want to say a couple things. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do it without them. And I'd like to thank Heather for letting us share this program with other libraries because you all know this. When libraries work together, we make magic. So, the way this is going to go is that Heather's going to share her slides for about 40 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. I'm going to close the chat during her slides so that we're not distracted, and then I'll open it up at the end. If you have questions for her, though, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, and I will moderate them as we get once her slides are over. So Heather Rogers is America's preeminent presidential doodler. Is so widely read, but she hasn't learned about the presidents and share her information about presidents as you would expect. And that makes it so much more accessible and so much more interesting, I think. Heather, thank you so much for being here. Again, I'm so excited about this.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I have been absolutely bouncing off the walls for the past week, excited to talk about John Adams with all of you.
Well, I can't wait. Like I said, I have that question. If you get to it, I'll be curious to hear what your answer is.
Okay, that's good. All right, so John Adams. Oh, I'm so excited to dive in. First of all, let me get started. Tell you briefly about me. I'm a freelance graphic designer, illustrator, and presidential nerd, and I have read at least one book about every US president out of spite. I filled over 16 sketchbooks along the way, doodling things that I've learned and wanted to remember. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be a recap webpage that'll have my sources, more of the doodles, a link to the presentation, additional reading material, etc. And then if any questions come up at the end that I have a supporting doodle about, I'll pop that in there too. And Mina will send out a link to this at the end of the presentation. I have a tendency to meander quite a bit when I talk. I explore quite a bit when I'm reading about the presidents, and then when I'm sharing the doodles too. The doodles kind of guide the conversation along. So I hope you can be patient with me because I actually have a very tangenty tangent that I'm excited to share with you today. So I hope you can indulge me. Last time it was challenging to pull together the presentation about George Washington because I've read 5 books about George Washington and doodled my way through 4 of them. So I had just had so many doodles, so much content, and I had to figure out what story I wanted to tell, which doodles I wanted to share. And it was really like editing it down was a struggle. And I did not expect, and I didn't realize until I started working on this presentation about John Adams, that I was going to have the exact opposite problem. I read one book about John Adams, David McCullough's John Adams. Actually, I listened to it on audio tape. And then I watched the HBO special that was based on the book. And then because at the beginning of my project, I didn't keep great notes, I didn't realize my project was going to spiral out of control. I forgot that I had listened to the audiobook and I went ahead and read it. So for John Adams, I have one book that I experienced 3 different ways, and I did not draw my way through it at all. Just as a point of comparison, uh, for William Henry Harrison, I read 2 books and I doodled my way through both, and he was president for like 32 days. So this seems unfair to John Adams, but this is where we are. This is what we're working with. Quickly about John Adams, he was born and died in Massachusetts. Thomas Jefferson said he was vain and irritable, and he had a famously bad temper. Also had a dog named Satan. Unlike the other founding fathers, there's no memorial to him in Washington, D.C. After the Boston Massacre, he defended the British and helped get 6 of them acquitted. Also, unlike the majority of the founding fathers, he was not an enslaver. He was our first vice president. and the first to live in the White House, though we didn't call it that officially until Theodore Roosevelt's time. He only lived there for 5 months. As vice president, he was known as the dangerous vice, aka his rotundity. Benjamin Franklin thought the vice president should be addressed as His Superfluous Excellency, and I don't know if he was joking or not, but I prefer to think that he was serious. John Adams said of the vice presidency that it was the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived of or his imagination conceived. I got that quote from a book about Millard Fillmore. There were a couple of other quotes about the vice presidency that I want to share too. One of FDR's vice presidents said being vice president wasn't worth a pitcher of warm piss. And Daniel Webster, who was asked by two people to be their running mate, said that he did not intend to be buried until he was dead. Now, through my project, I have a set of rules that govern my project because I love rules. And along the way, I've had to add a few amendments. Like when I read this book, the quotes are from The Remarkable Millard Fillmore, which happened to be misfiled at the library. It should have been under the humor section, but I didn't discover that right away. It was filed in the biography section. And you might think that the unicorn on the cover was a little bit of a clue that this wasn't fully based in reality, but you would be mistaken. So I subsequently added an amendment that only nonfiction counts for my project. John Adams thought the president should be addressed as His Highness the President of the United States of America and protector of their liberties. I would have thought that the protector of their liberties bit was kind of implied, but it turns out that's actually not a given. His colleagues thought this was a skosh monarchical, and also it doesn't really fit on a business card well. So we just call him president. Here's how he stacks up with all the other presidents we've had. So the highlighted column there is John Quincy, and then we've got the minimum and the maximum. He was on the shorter side, standing at just 5'7", with one wife, 6 kids. He started the presidency at 61, ended at 65, having served 4 years as president with one vice president. And he lived 25 years after his presidency ended for a total of 90 years. So another one of the rules that I set for my project is that I didn't need to read the presidents in chronological order, which led me to discover a lot of things that I wouldn't have otherwise discovered. But it also skewed my understanding of the presidents. So it just happened to be that I read that the first several I picked either died during their presidency or didn't live long after, which got me curious about how long presidents were to live after their presidency, and did they all have short lives? So I created this chart one night, and the bar indicates the length of the lifespan. Then the darker blue is the presidency, and anything after the dark blue is the amount they lived afterward. So I never would have made this chart if I'd read in chronological order, since there was a bunch in the first batch of presidents that lived a significant chunk of time after their presidency ended. So here's John Adams. You can see significant chunk after his presidency. You can also see the guy after him. His bar ends exactly the same time. But what I thought was really cool about this chart is that this led me to discover that at the time, 3/4 of our most recent 4 presidents were all born in 1946. So, and not only that, I learned a few years later, they were all born in the summer of 1946. So we had a June 1946, a July 1946, and an August 1946, which is kind of crazy. But back to John Adams. His vice president was Thomas Jefferson. So at the time, whoever won the election became president, and whoever came in second place became vice president. Now, this was the first and last only time that the president and the vice president were different parties, because as you can imagine, that creates a little bit of tension. John Adams was married to the incomparable Abigail Adams, and they had 6 children, only one of whom became president. I gathered 3 John Adams quotes that I thought were interesting and or relevant. The government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. But a constitution of government, once changed from freedom, can never be restored. Liberty, once lost, is lost forever. And he reflected on the failure of 15th century Italian republics, saying they are all alike ill constituted, all alike miserable, and all ended in similar disgrace and despotism. I don't want to dwell on those quotes for too long because my presentation will turn into a little bit of a bummer. So we're going to shift into a lightning round where we compare John Adams to all the other guys we're talking about this year. So George Washington through Zachary Taylor. He was not born in Virginia. He was born in Massachusetts. And after John Quincy Adams, we don't have another president born in Massachusetts until JFK. And then after that, H.W. Bush. He was a college graduate, specifically Harvard. He was the first of many presidents who were lawyers before their presidency. And I believe still to this day, lawyer is the most popular pre-presidential career. He served as ambassador to the UK and also to the Netherlands. And in fact, he was sent to the Netherlands on a mission to get them to recognize the United States as a country, and he was successful. I think it took a couple of years. But eventually, he ultimately became our very first ambassador to the Netherlands. He served as vice president, becoming president in his 60s, with a direct descendant who also became president. In his case, it was father and son, and that's only happened twice. It wouldn't happen again until the Bushes. He served one full term, dying on July 4th, 1826. And it wasn't until I pulled all of that together that I noticed he has a lot of overlap with George H.W. Bush that I never picked up on before. They were both born in Massachusetts. Both had Ivy League education, though Harvard of John Adams' day was not quite Harvard of today. Both had 6 kids. Both tragically lost a daughter as a toddler. They served as vice president, became president in their 60s, served one term. Their son was elected president. Both are in the top 5 longest lived presidents and the top 5 longest post-presidencies. So let's get to it. In no particular order, a bunch of John Adams doodles. He was born in this house, and his son, John Quincy Adams, was born in that house. I pulled together this family tree years ago. A couple of things I want to point out. First of all, I've never seen any evidence that John Adams smiled, so I took some liberties with this family tree. And also, for some reason, I didn't put the kids in chronological order. So it should be Abigail Adams Smith, also known as Nabby, and John Quincy Adams. Susanna, who died at just 2 years old, months before Charles was born. Then Thomas, and then Elizabeth, who was tragically stillborn. John Quincy married Louisa, and together they had 4 children, including Charles Sr., who married Abigail and had 7 kids, including Charles Francis Adams Jr. and Henry Adams. And both of them show up quite a bit in my presidential reading, specifically Henry Adams, because he was a historian. And also wanted to point out that, like his grandfather and great-grandfather, he served as ambassador to the UK, in his case under President Lincoln. When I read First Conspiracy, it painted the country in a way that I hadn't truly understood before. New York City was 50-50, rebels, loyalists. The New York governor was a loyalist. I didn't know that. So he was threatening bloodshed if people rebelled. We were toppling the statue of King George III, the militias being called up. George Washington is ordering himself a uniform. All this stuff is happening. There's a parade in New York City to honor William Tryon because he just returned from New York City the same day that there was a parade in town to honor George Washington, which was super awkward. And Tryon was like really miffed that his parade had to wait 2 hours for George Washington's parade to be over. So all this stuff is happening. And then I read that John Adams said, Great Britain has at last driven America to the last step, a complete separation from her, a total absolute independence, not only of her parliament, but of her crown. And this completely blew my mind because I thought we'd already decided that. This shifted everything for me. But all the stuff happening, there's assassination plots to kill George Washington and all these different things and traitors and et cetera. But we weren't after independence at first. We just wanted rights, which just completely blew my mind. And for some reason, it made me think of Ross and Rachel from Friends and the colonies saying, maybe we should take a break. And England's like, okay, fine, let's go get some froyo. And then the colonies are like, no, a break from us. So John Adams, together with four others, get together to write the Declaration of Independence. And so it was John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Sherman, and Robert Livingston, who actually didn't sign it because he was in New York, but all these other guys did, and a bunch more, which is kind of common knowledge. But I only recently learned that there were copies of the Declaration of Independence printed in Maryland by Mary Catherine Goddard, and she had her name printed on the bottom. And this is not nothing because that was a huge risk to just print the Declaration of Independence, but to print her name on it as well. If things had turned out differently, she would have hung just as easily as these guys who wrote it and the other guys that signed it. It also came to my attention recently that this wasn't just a revolution, it was a civil war. And yeah, it was Americans versus British, but it was also Americans versus Americans. One of the things on the recap webpage is a list of 8 incredible women that made an impact on the Revolutionary War, and Abigail Adams is in that list. She was a vocal supporter of independence. She said, let us separate. They are unworthy to be our brethren. She kept detailed records of what was going on and provided important insights to her husband. She was also an abolitionist and a huge advocate for education for women and women's rights in general. And she famously asked that her husband remember the ladies. But zooming out for a second to the larger context of this, remember the ladies, she wrote to him, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. We know that he relied on her intellect, her insight, her guidance. Like he valued women and their contribution. So it completely blew my mind that his response was basically like, LOL. Like he didn't take this seriously at all. So the women are at home. The men are, they might be out fighting or working on government issues and writing declarations of independence, etc. And so the women you might have tons of children. They might be breastfeeding or pregnant. They might be managing the family business if their husbands are away. But on top of all of that, they're in so much danger. John Quincy Adams, years later, said that for the span of 12 months, my mother with her infant children dwelt, liable every hour of the day and night to be butchered in cold blood or taken and carried to Boston as hostages by the same hands which on the 17th of June lighted the fires of Charlestown. I saw with my own eyes those fires and heard Britannia's thunders in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Like the danger was right there. And John Adams had said to her, if the war comes too close, just gather the kids and hide in the woods. They had, like, depending on the time, that would have been like 4 or 5 kids, and maybe she was pregnant. I can't imagine gathering 4 or 5 kids and rushing off to the grocery store, let alone to the woods to hide from war. Even though John Adams was surrounded by the most informed and brightest minds of the time, he wrote to Abigail, I always learn more of politics from your letters than any others. And the reverence he had for wives, too, I thought was evident in this quote about the British Admiral William Howe and his brother General Richard Howe. He said, I believe the two Howes have not very great women for wives. A smart wife would have put Howe in possession of Philadelphia a long time ago. This one here, Richard Howe, was known as Black Dick because rumor had it that knowing a bunch of people were going to die imminently was the only time he would smile. I tried to limit the Abigail Adams quotes. I had a really hard time thinning it down. This was the best I could do. So here are a few of my favorites. Did ever a kingdom or state regain their liberty when once it was invaded without bloodshed? I cannot think of it without horror. The only alternative which every American thinks of is liberty or death. She wrote that to Catherine Macaulay months before Patrick Henry's speech. Courage, I know we have in abundance. Conduct, I hope we shall not want. But powder, where shall we get a sufficient supply? And I think my favorite was, I wish sincerely there was not a slave in the province. It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me. Fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. You know my mind on the subject. Which brings me to Elizabeth Freeman Mumbet. She was an enslaved woman. Her husband had died fighting with the Patriots. And she worked in a household with an important man who, at the time, there were a bunch of guys there working on passing the Constitution. And she overheard them say, excuse me, all men are born free and equal. And she was like, what's that now? She went off and got a lawyer and sued for her freedom, and she won. And she got the ball rolling for abolition in Massachusetts, which is incredible. So on top of everything else that's happening, there are also financial troubles. John had seen a steep reduction in business, and he wrote to Abigail in 1774, I don't receive a shilling a week. In a separate letter, he confessed that he was afraid the loyalists would prevail and crush the cause of liberty, but he had to stick with it, and he needed her as well. He wrote, frugality, my dear, frugality. I must entreat you, my partner in all the joys and sorrows, prosperity and adversity of my life, to take part with me in this struggle. He stressed the importance of, being economical with what they were eating and how they were dressing, etc. One of the things I admire most about Abigail is that she always sided with the powerless. She favored the colonies, the enslaved, in women over England, the enslavers, and men. And she wrote to John, if we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women. It's worth pointing out that when John found out their daughter was learning classical languages, he asked them to kind of like keep it under wraps because, quote, it is scarcely reputable for young ladies to understand Latin and Greek. I roll. After New York was taken by the British, she wrote to John, we are in no way dispirited here. We possess a spirit that will not be conquered. If our men are all drawn off and we should be attacked, you would find a race of Amazons in America. One of the things I was really struck by when reading Founding Mothers recently was how these people were all over the place. They're all over Europe. They're constantly spending time away from each other and in company with different people. And I had this idea that I was going to map out this gorgeous timeline that showed exactly who was where between the Adams and other people like Ben Franklin and John Jay, et cetera, who was where at what time and how long. It was going to be this lovely thing. And I started doing it, and it was a lot of fun. But then I realized that I couldn't figure it out. I gave it up in a tantrum of scribbles. And I had tried to find other sources because the book, while lovely, and I really enjoy it, and I highly recommend it, it would say things like, and Thomas Jefferson was appointed to France. And so I draw France and I draw Thomas Jefferson. And then 5 pages later, I'd find out Thomas Jefferson said no. So it totally threw me. And I had looked for other sources of information and found nothing until much later. I found this gorgeous timeline on Massachusetts Historical Society's website where you can click on each of the atoms and line them all up. So I've pulled together something that hopefully makes a little bit more sense. If there are any mistakes here, they're my mistakes, not the Historical Society's. And I did simplify it a bit, so there was a little bit more back and forth on this. In 1777, John Adams is appointed commissioner to France. So he went off, and John Quincy Adams wanted to go too. He was just 10, so the two of them went. Then June of 79, they're back in Boston, where almost as soon as they get home, they're told they have to go back. So by November, they're on their way to France, and this time they brought Charles with them. And then they're in Amsterdam. And then they're in Amsterdam, but then John Quincy leaves and he goes to Russia. And then Charles is homesick, so he goes back home. And then John and John Quincy are in England. And then they find out they're going to have to stay in Europe for a long time. So he finally calls for Abigail, and Abigail brings their daughter Nabby, and they head off to England. And at first they're in different states, or different countries, excuse me, but then they eventually meet up in England. So Abigail had not seen her son in 6.5 years, and she only recognized him by his eyes, which I cannot even imagine. That they're all in France, and then John Quincy has to go back to school, and then they're in England, and then they're in America, which is just so crazy. And they have a whole other kid that's not a part of this at all. So it just blew my mind. While they were in France, they spent a lot of time with Benjamin Franklin, who was like much older than John Adams. They had different temperaments. They had different values and ways to spend their extracurricular time, shall we say. Benjamin Franklin said of John Adams, he was always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. I also want to point out, I learned recently that he had a self-appointed censor who would attend dinners with him, and this guy's role was to just like quickly change topics if Benjamin Franklin started talking about secret stuff that he wasn't supposed to be sharing. John Adams was a tough dad. He wrote to John Quincy Adams at one point, "You come into life with advantages which will disgrace you if your success is mediocre. If you do not rise to the head not only of your profession, but of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness, slovenliness, and obstinacy." Yikes, it's a lot of pressure. But I have a hard time squaring it with this other quote years later. "If I had to go over my life again, I'd be a shoemaker rather than an American statesman." So the founding fathers took this huge country with diverse people, an unwieldy machine, and they shaped it into a union with people who identified more with their country than with their state. He had written to Rufus King at one point that he thought stronger federal ties would happen through marriage of people from different states. He said, "It will be unnatural if federal purposes are not answered by all these intermarriages," which kind of, I was tickled by this, like the idea of a marriage between somebody from Massachusetts and New York being an intermarriage. It makes perfect sense because at the time, these colonies were almost like different countries on themselves, but still, just something I'd never considered. Which brought me to a crazy tangent that I wanted to include in the presentation. You should know my maiden name is Rockwood, Heather Rockwood. So I dug out my family history, history of the Rockwoods from the time they first emigrated to the country to the present time, 1855. And I started digging around for this thing that I thought was relevant that I really wanted to share with you. And then I reached out to my mom, and it turns out the thing that I wanted to share, I totally misremembered it, and it's not relevant for this conversation, but it's definitely something I want to look into in the future. But while I was digging around in these documents, I found something that absolutely delighted me. So I had family in Groton. Groton is all over this document, which absolutely tickled me because the Groton Public Library is one of the collaborators in this series, making this series possible. So that just like absolutely floored me. So just to keep going for a sec, my ancestor, Richard Rocket, was among the first to settle in Dorchester in 1630, and he removed thence to Braintree. I know I said my ancestors were named Rockwood, but apparently it was a tradition among the Rockwoods that there hadn't been any consistent spelling convention. So sometimes Rocket was with one T, and sometimes Rocket was with two T's, and sometimes Rocket was spelled Rockwood, which to me makes no sense, but who am I to argue? So Richard Rocket had a son named Nathaniel Rocket, who ended up going as Nathaniel Rockwood. And he had a son named Elisha Rockwood. And Elisha had a bunch of kids born in Groton starting in 1739. And just for a point of comparison, John Adams was born in Braintree a few years before Elisha Rockwood started having children. And the Braintree I thought was kind of cool because Braintree became Quincy, and Quincy libraries are also part of this collaboration. And if you just have to imagine, I was like bouncing off the walls when I discovered this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the way through my great grandfather, who was born in Groton in the latest of 1800s, and then eventually me. So my great grandfather, Albert Rockwood, was born in 1899 in Groton, and the Groton Public Library opened in 1854. So I can't help but wonder if he went there, first of all, and secondly, like my family was in Groton longer than the Groton Library was in Groton, which is completely blew my mind. But anyway, I have to get back on track. And I thought just maybe I had family in Massachusetts marrying family in New York. And I could tell you that my family helped strengthen the federal ties through marriage. But that's not the case. My grandparents were both born and married in Massachusetts and then came to New York. So I kept digging through the family documents to try to find some way to provide this smooth segue back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. And I discovered Elisha Rockwood had a grandson who was born on February 4th, 1797, which is awesome because exactly 1 month later, John Adams was sworn in. And I thought that was the perfect segue to gracefully bring me back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. But at the time, the only thing I had left to do in my presentation was to figure out that European map. And frankly, it was very intimidating and I didn't want to work on it. And I am nothing if not a master procrastinator. So I remembered that there is an Adams in my family tree, just one. And it's nobody's ever talked about it in the family. I've never heard any rumblings of anything. And it's, what are the odds? But also, like, my family was in Braintree and in Massachusetts, so maybe. And so, in the spirit of procrastination, I decided to dig into Elizabeth Adams. She was married to Elisha Rockwood and is part of the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera that eventually leads to me. Her dad was James Adams the first, and his dad was Moses Adams, and his dad was Lieutenant Henry Adams, and his dad was Henry Adams, who maybe moved from Braintree, England to Braintree, Massachusetts, although that Braintree, England part might not be true. And I kept digging because, again, I am really good at procrastination. One of his other sons was Captain Joseph Adams Sr., whose son was Joseph Adams Jr., whose son was John Adams Sr., and maybe you can see where I'm going with this. I was bouncing off the walls when I discovered this connection. I did not expect it. It wasn't anything that I really thought would result in anything other than just procrastination. Backing up a teensy bit, Henry Adams' dad is also John Adams. So I think The other John Adams is my 11X grandfather, and the John Adams is my something cousin removed a bunch of times, I think. Yeah, I have to throw in a bunch of caveats with this because I don't know anything about genealogy. I don't know if I was relying on sources that are maybe not fully reliable, but I did compare them back to my family documents, so I think this is legit. Anyway, this is not about me, so we've got to get back to John Adams. He's elected president and writes that Jefferson will be Daddy Vice, which I'm glad we don't refer to it like that anymore. Abigail was a little thrown by this because she wasn't sure how she would censor herself as the wife of her president. Um, she was, quote, used to a freedom of sentiment. And John Adams answered, a woman can be silent when she will, which I'm not quite sure what to make of, but I kind of think is funny. And speaking of silencing women, in 1776, the New Jersey state constitution didn't include or exclude women from voting. In 1790, they actually added he or she, but that only meant property owners. So that could only be single or widowed ladies. And my guess is perhaps only single and widowed ladies without men in the family. In any case, it was enough women that they decided they needed to walk that back in 1807 to ensure the safety, quiet, good order, and dignity of the state that one can only accomplish when men are in charge of everything. Put in a slightly different way, with waving states before America was America, when it was just little bitty baby America, women could vote in New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. And then they couldn't. And we'll get into that more when we talk about James Madison down the line. So, as president, William Henry Harrison had suggested to John Adams, as president, that the gargantuan Northwest Territory be split in two. And so it was. So he ended up with Indiana and Ohio. And John Adams put Harrison in charge of the Indiana Territory, which was 260,000 square miles, bigger than France. And Harrison was 27 years old. The slave states voted to ban slavery in this territory because slavery is bad. Just kidding. Because they didn't want to lose their competitive edge with tobacco. And also, just for the record, slavery is bad. Years later, when William Henry Harrison was running for president, John Adams said, this person's thirst for public office is absolutely rabid. He's a political adventurer with a lively and active but shallow mind. And then flashing back to his presidency, in 1880, it was a bit of a mixed bag for John Adams. The hostilities had ended between France and the United States, which was like his biggest accomplishment, something he was most proud of. He moved into the executive mansion. His son, John Quincy, was thriving as minister to Prussia. Then his son, Charles, died. And he lost the re-election to Jefferson. Now, John Quincy was in London when he heard his dad was elected, and he was actually not happy about that because he was afraid he'd look like a little Nepo baby. And then fast forward to when his dad lost the re-election, John Adams recalled his son. Abigail was thrilled that her son and his wife and grandchildren were all coming home. John Quincy was not. He absolutely loved his life abroad and was distraught to have to return. When they were in France together, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were very close. Their families were close. They relied on each other. They hung out a lot together. They respected each other immensely. But they eventually split over states' rights, the French Revolution, presidential power, and all this other stuff that separates the Federalists from the Republicans. Then I think it was like 12 years or so, they didn't speak. And then their mutual friend, Benjamin Rush, had kind of had enough of it. A couple side notes. Benjamin Rush also signed the Declaration of Independence, and so did his father-in-law, Richard Stockton. Richard Stockton was captured by the British and tortured, and he was the only signer to swear not to do anything else against King George. The British eventually released him, but he was never the same again, and he died before the war ended. Benjamin Rush had had enough of his friends not talking to each other, so he lied to both of them. He told Thomas Jefferson that John Adams really wanted to chat, and he told John Adams that Thomas Jefferson really wanted to chat, and it worked. Um, they started writing letters again, and they wrote letters for the next 14 years until they died, including this one that John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, which he, talking about himself, said he was in the 89th year of age and still too fat to last much longer. In the following year, when he was 90 and on his deathbed, he said, Thomas Jefferson survives. He did not. So after George Washington died, it was 26 years before the next president died, Thomas Jefferson, the longest time we've ever gone between presidential deaths still. And then just 5.5 hours later, John Adams kicked the bucket. The shortest period of time between presidential deaths still. So as I mentioned, I do not have any doodles in this presentation from the book, David McCullough's book, but I still do highly recommend it. It was really fantastic. And a lot of these doodles were from founding mothers, and the rest were from a bunch of Washington books, etc. And next time we are going to talk about Daddy Vice himself, Thomas Jefferson. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather. Oh my gosh, that was perfect. I know last time we had talked a little bit about it going too fast, but I think this pace was ideal. And
Okay.
no matter what your excitement was, you kept it together. I appreciate it. Okay, so I have a couple comments that I wanted to say first. Somebody said in the chat that there's an organization working to create an Adams Memorial in Washington, D.C. And when you said that there was something early on about the vice president, it's kind of being like a stinky job. Somebody said a lot of people would like to be one heartbeat from the presidency. And somebody also mentioned that their daughter Susanna died when she was 1. I think you had said something around 2, but like I think that's about the same. Um, People are loving this. I really appreciate it. And I really think, not enough can be said about John Adams and his wife Abigail and how they worked as a team to make his presidency amazing. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. Okay, so if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We have about just like 15, 20 minutes to go through them. So I'm going to start. Have you visited the 3 homes of John Adams? They are wonderful.
No, so when I was in Boston last summer, my plan was to hit up those houses on the way home, and the only day I was able to go, they were closed. But I am hoping to go before we talk about John Quincy Adams in June.
Yeah, we're just going to keep going. Why was the dog named Satan? Who would name the dog Satan?
Why was named Satan? Because it didn't seem to me and maybe I'm wrong, but it didn't seem to me that John Adams was particularly had a great sense of humor.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll have to see if I can find anything.
Okay. I do want to let people know that I will send a link in a recap email. Heather has created this amazing website just for this program, and she includes like recaps of every single one with additional resources. So I'll send that out after our talk. Pat wants to know which president had 15 children.
Oh, that was William Henry Harrison. No. Oh my gosh. No, not him. Tyler. Between 2 different wives. And his story is bonkers. So yeah, I'll
That
share more later.
in December, you're here, you'll be here for it. What did Susanna die from? Do you know?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay. Have you ever doodled about Henry and Clover? Nope. Okay. Um, I know you got this question a lot last time. Have you seen Ken Burns' American Revolution?
Okay, I have now. I have one more episode to go, but I took that in turn as my homework assignment from last time. I'm in the last season of Turn as well. Yeah, it's phenomenal.
Excellent. Okay, so you're going to catch that last one. All right, that's a comment. What was the basis of Elizabeth Freeman's lawsuit to become free from slavery that convinced the Massachusetts government?
All men are created free and equal. And apparently even the fact that it said men in there, and she was obviously not a man, that didn't slow her down. Like was she still went for it. And I thought it was interesting. I think her attorney was somebody that she used to work for. I would imagine was enslaved by. Um, but that story blew my mind. And I only know the tiniest bit about it, but I need to know more.
And also about Bonbet, he lived in Sheffield, Berkshire County. This is a comment. Her owners were not particularly pleasant to her. The lawyer who she engaged was Theodore Sedgwick of Stockbridge, Berkshire, Mass. She is buried in the old Stockbridge Cemetery with the Sedgwick family, and actress Kira Sedgwick is a direct descendant of Theodore Sedgwick.
Oh, wow.
I
Hmm.
know. I mean, 6 degrees of separation. It's amazing.
Seriously, seriously.
Have you seen the HBO series about John Adams?
Yes, years ago. I kind of wanted to rewatch it before talking about him, but I did not get to that. It's too busy with Turn and Ken Burns.
Okay. Well, also finding your own history, which was just amazing how you dug into there. And even if it's not exact, it's amazing.
Yeah, I had so much fun with that. And there are so many coincidences when I, I can't even tell you how like off the wall excited I was. There's so many weird coincidences and like the next day I pulled together a blog post about it just for my own reference, but it's kind of I think interesting. And it's linked on that webpage. But the next day, a friend of mine told me that a woman on Finding Your Roots had just learned the same thing. And she came out with that the same day I discovered it. And I didn't hear about it till the next day. Sarah Haynes from The View. I was just like, you've got to be kidding me. And so all this, I don't know. It's just a whole bunch of coincidences and serendipity and craziness. And I love it.
Mm. It does. Maybe we should all be doing these genealogies because you just never know, right?
I,
Are you a member of the Daughters of American Revolution?
I'm not, no.
Okay. Where was Abigail educated? She's so incredibly smart.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to look that up. I feel like I should know, but I didn't doodle it. And if I don't doodle something, I don't remember it.
Um, why didn't the wives and their families go with their husbands when they were out of the country? It sounds like John Quincy Adams's wife, Louisa, went with him, but why not?
Well, she was from England. She was an American, so she was there in her own home. Um, I think there's so many different factors at play, and I know with Abigail and John, I don't think she particularly liked to travel, and it was that last trip he had to make where he knew he was going to be overseas for a long time, and that was finally the impetus. But they didn't bring their kids. Like the last child, Thomas, the last living child, I should say, he didn't go at all. He ended up later traveling with John Quincy, his brother, but can you imagine just being left behind by your parents? It's like heartbreaking.
That
Or
is.
even, yeah, John Adams was away from Thomas, I think, for 9 years straight.
Oh
It's,
man.
yeah.
Well, and in the chat, somebody says that they were often pregnant, the women. But I'm like, what did the guys do? Like, did they come back and forth and impregnate them? Like,
That's what it felt like sometimes. Even the men that were here in America, but not in the same area as their wives. It felt like they just like came home, impregnated them, gave them something extra to do, and then left.
oh my God. And then told them to like, not spend money.
Right.
Joanne says, according to family research, she's also related to John Adams, and Abigail was educated at home by her mother, but she read a lot. So, and she had friends with whom she had educational discussions. That's awesome.
Perfect.
Um, and Carol says the Adams National Park has a wonderful timeline in their brochure. Good to know. How did Abigail and John get together? She seems like she would prefer someone who would be more supportive of women's rights.
Yeah. So I don't know how they got together actually, but I can't wrap my head around his lack of support for that. I don't know if it was that he also didn't believe in it or he just didn't think it would get anywhere
Hmm.
because everybody else's viewpoints. So I'm not really sure, but it, yeah, it just blows my mind because he clearly saw the value of women, the intelligence of women, like relied on it. Yeah.
Couple comments. John Quincy Adams was sixth president and born in Massachusetts, so not only two born in Mass and not next born in Massachusetts was JFK. Um,
Oh, he was highlighted on that slide. John
okay,
Quincy, John Adams,
got it.
both.
And Quincy Public Library last year put on a presentation with two historical actors. It was amazing. The Adams during the Revolution, love affair, and both very humorous and intelligent. Us libraries are killing it, I tell you.
Yeah.
Oh, that was just my own opinion. Emily wants to know, do you have a favorite Adams from the family tree?
I think it would have to be Abigail. Like after I just learned so much more about her from that book, Founding Mothers, and like I knew she was incredible to begin with, but even way more so than I had imagined.
Hmm. I mean, just from what you told us today, it sounds way more than I've ever heard. Um, what book did discuss women being able to vote in the early colonies?
So that was from I think one of those doodles was from Founding Mothers, I think, and the other was from a book that was not even remotely related. Now I'm blanking on it now. 1920, I think. I think a book I read about the 1920 presidential election. I could be wrong about that. I'll have to look that one up. It was something totally not related at all
Mhm.
to that period of time.
And I just want to remind everybody that when I send out the link to the page that Heather created on her website, it has all of this information. It has the book recommendations, it'll have the video, all of it. Um, let's see. When you go back to Quincy, make sure you go to Abigail's cairn at the top of Penn's Hill. That is where she and John Quincy watched the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Oh,
I know, I
perfect.
feel like I have to take a field trip.
Yeah.
Did Abigail have a direct influence on any specific political decision by John Adams?
I'm trying to think of specific examples. I'm sure she did, and I'm blanking on any specific examples, but he really did rely on her very heavily for her advice. They didn't always agree, but
Well, most spouses don't, right? Theirs just had global implications.
yeah.
Um, what inspired you to study the presidents? You
Um,
said for spite. What was that? What does that mean?
okay, so I overheard a conversation years ago. I was kind of a part of it, but I couldn't contribute to it, where people were talking about presidents. It is my a colleague of mine and my then boyfriend, and just like off the cuff, I was like, "Oh, I'm going to read a book about every president," because I couldn't keep up and it was embarrassing. And so I didn't enjoy it because I wasn't interested in history at all. And I certainly wasn't interested in the presidents. But then the more I learned, the more interesting it became when I started drawing, et cetera, et cetera. And that just kind of spiraled out of control
I
to all
believe.
of us.
Was Charles the son an alcoholic? After reading David McCullough's book, I was struck by the Adams struggle, just like people these days.
Yeah, that's my understanding. He was an alcoholic, and it ran in the family. There were others as well, in John Quincy's family as well. And it seemed like the kids who were left behind by both John Quincy and John Adams were the ones that struggled the most.
Hmm. Lisa says also Edie Sedgwick from the 1960s. I mean, gosh, there's just genealogy all over the place. I love it. Um, how do your doodles happen? Are they pen and paper? Do you do it on, like on a tablet? And I would like to know, do you actually hand write all of them, or do you have an app for that?
Oh no, I handwrite all of them.
Wow.
So mostly my sketches when I read, those are all in like sketchbooks, pen and paper, and I don't use any pencil, which they could be better if I use pencil, but I specifically, that's one of my rules because I just wanted to be quick and get the information from the book or from my head onto the page as quickly as possible. I also do draw like this, the John Adams drawing that was on the cover slide. That one was drawn on the computer. So sometimes, depending on what I'm doing, I'll draw it on the computer or take something from my sketchbook and add motion to it on
Mm,
a in a design program.
love it. I just put it in the chat. The chat is open to everyone. I know there's lots of thoughts and comments in there if you want to post them publicly so everybody can learn from each other. Have you read some of John Adams's pamphlets? Do you have thoughts on them? Because his thoughts on government was a stepping stone to state constitutions.
I have not. I've mostly focused on reading books. So if there's snippets of pamphlets in the books, but otherwise I haven't read them. But I feel like my project is morphing the more I go about it, where like I would be more inclined to look at those things up now than in the past, or
Mhm.
learn from, going to various locations, etc.
Um, it makes sense. The more you learn, the more you want to, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Madeline says, I believe the Boston Public Library is John Adams's presidential library. Is that true?
Oh. Hmm, interesting. There are all these rules behind presidential libraries and what constitutes a presidential library, and the official ones I think are affiliated through the National Archives. So there's some that seem presidential library-ish, but are they the official presidential library? So I don't know the answer to that, but I need to look into it because it sounds like I need to go there anyway, regardless.
I think you also need to make a field trip up here. Carol says Abigail was educated at home with her two brothers. When they went to Harvard, the brothers shared with her. She was not allowed a formal education.
Mm.
Um, this is interesting. Robert says wives typically had to take care of the farm, property, and children, so they could not travel as much. And I think the same was true with Martha Washington. Didn't she stay home while
Uh,
George did his thing?
Yeah, she would go stay with him in the winter, but it depends too. Like certain families would have enslaved people to run things when they were not around, and certain people would not have that. So
Mm-hmm. That's true. They chose not to have slaves, which is good. Have you seen the movie musical 1776 with William Daniels as John Adams?
I have not. I've looked up different songs, so I haven't seen the whole thing.
Kitty says, Mina, librarians are killing it. I love Kitty. Um, where does Mortissa? Oh no. Several books about JQA's wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, and several times living overseas. We'll be talking about those when we talk about John Quincy Adams. And the author of Founding Mothers is Cokie Roberts, is that right?
Yeah.
Do you have a book of all your presidential doodles?
No, not yet, but hopefully someday.
She's busy doing this, guys. Um,
Right.
and Boston Public Library does have John Adams's papers, which sounds fascinating. What do you think would have happened if women at that time were allowed to continue to vote? Early female politicians or women with more influence or what?
Oh, oh gosh. I don't even know. This makes me kind of sad to think about. I know it was walked back during James Madison when he was running for office, because it's my understanding, I'm going to dig in more. It was very inconvenient that the way that women were voting, and it wasn't going to put him in the White House. So that's why it was stripped back.
Hmm.
Um, ugh. I would love to think that like if women were more involved, like by now we'd have a few female presidents and that kind of thing. Maybe a few fewer wars. I don't know.
Maybe. And was John Adams the principal author of the Massachusetts Constitution?
I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
It wasn't a question, it was a comment that he was, but I wondered if you knew about that.
I don't know anything about that. No. I
And
coming in very light with John Adams because, as I mentioned, I only remember things if I doodle them, and since I didn't doodle my way through his book, I'm at a disadvantage.
Abigail only had one brother, William, and he died of alcoholism also. Quincy is pronounced Quincy, and they are
Yes,
building a library for John Adams in Quincy.
yes. Okay, that's awesome. And I had recently learned that from Alexis Coe, I think, mentioned that she had learned it. And so I was like, do I say Quincy? Or do I say Quincy? You don't even understand how wrapped up I am in not mispronouncing different cities from Massachusetts. But then I went ahead and did it anyway.
That's okay. No matter how much you practice, sometimes it just doesn't come out right. I have to really think twice about Worcester. I
Oh,
have to say it that way, otherwise I say it wrong.
yeah.
So, what is on tap for next month? It's 11:30. I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time. We are going to
Thomas Jefferson. We're going to talk about
Thomas
Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson, the big one.
Yeah,
I don't know how you're going to titrate everything he did into a 45-minute or 40-minute conversation,
yeah.
but
I'm going to do my best.
okay.
And I'm related to him. Just kidding.
Well, probably we're all related in some way, somehow. But I really, really appreciate this, Heather. It's been fascinating, and all of the questions and comments have really filled out my knowledge of this amazing president and his wife.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Me
Looking
too.
forward
So, all right, I'll send out that recap email in a couple of hours with all of the information and Heather's website resources. So, thank you all for being here, and I will see you next month.
Sounds good. Bye,
Good night,
everybody.
goodbye, everybody.